Sarah Martinez had always been small for her age. At 22 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed just 110 pounds soaking wet. When she walked into the military recruitment office in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, the sergeant behind the desk barely looked up from his paperwork. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked without lifting his eyes. "I want to enlist," Sarah said firmly, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her body. The sergeant finally looked up, taking in her petite frame and delicate features. His eyebrows raised slightly and a small smirk crossed his face. "What branch are you thinking about? Maybe the Air Force has some desk jobs that might suit you." Sarah had expected this reaction. She had been getting it her whole life. Teachers who assumed she couldn't handle difficult courses, coaches who overlooked her for sports teams, employers who questioned whether she could manage physical tasks. But none of that had prepared her for what she was about to say next. "I want to try out for Special Forces," she said quietly. The sergeant's pen stopped moving across his paperwork. He looked up again, this time really studying her face to see if she was joking. When he realized she was serious, he let out a short laugh that echoed through the small office. "Special Forces? You mean like the Green Berets?" He shook his head slowly. "Miss, I don't think you understand what that involves. These guys are the toughest soldiers in our military. They carry 100-pound packs through swamps. They fight in hand-to-hand combat. They jump out of airplanes in the middle of the night." Sarah had heard all of this before. She had spent months researching Special Forces training, watching documentaries, reading books written by former operators. She knew exactly what she was asking for. "I understand," she replied simply. The sergeant leaned back in his chair, studying her with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Look, I admire your spirit, I really do. But Special Forces isn't about spirit. It's about raw physical capability. The dropout rate is over 80%, and that's for men who weigh twice what you do." Sarah had been born in a small town in New Mexico, the youngest of 4 children. Her father worked construction, and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. Money was always tight in the Martinez household, but her parents had instilled something important in all their children: the belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. When Sarah was 12 years old, her older brother Miguel joined the Army. He would send letters home describing his training, his missions, the brothers he served alongside. Sarah devoured every word. While her friends were interested in typical teenage things, Sarah found herself drawn to stories of courage and service. Her high school guidance counselor had tried to steer her toward community college and a degree in education or nursing. "Those are good, stable careers for someone like you," the counselor had said. The phrase, "someone like you," had stuck with Sarah for years. She knew what it meant: someone small, someone quiet, someone who should know her place. But Sarah had never been good at knowing her place. In high school, she had tried out for the wrestling team. The coach had laughed outright, telling her that wrestling was a man's sport and that she would get hurt. Sarah had persisted until he finally agreed to let her practice with the team, probably hoping she would quit after getting thrown around by boys twice her size. She didn't quit. She showed up every day, getting thrown, pinned, and sometimes accidentally hurt by teammates who didn't know how to hold back. But she also learned. She studied technique obsessively, watching videos online and reading everything she could find about leverage and strategy. By her senior year, Sarah had earned the grudging respect of her teammates. She wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but she was absolutely the most determined. She had developed a fighting style that relied on speed, technique, and an almost supernatural ability to endure pain and keep going. The wrestling coach, the same man who had laughed at her 3 years earlier, told her parents at graduation that Sarah was the hardest worker he had ever coached. "That girl has something special inside her," he said. "I don't know what it is, but she's going to do something important with her life." Now, sitting across from the military recruiter, Sarah remembered those words. She also remembered every person who had told her she was too small, too weak, too different to achieve her goals. "I'd like to take the physical fitness test," she said calmly. The sergeant sighed and pulled out a form. "I'll let you take the test, but I want you to understand something first. The minimum standards for special forces are much higher than regular Army. You need to do 71 push-ups in 2 minutes, 78 sit-ups in 2 minutes, and run 2 miles in under 13 minutes. And that's just to qualify for the selection course." Sarah nodded. She had been preparing for these exact standards for over a year. The physical fitness test was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a local military training facility. Sarah spent the weekend doing final preparations, running through her usual routine of calisthenics and distance running. She had been following a brutal training schedule for months, getting up at 4 in the morning to run before work and spending her evenings doing bodyweight exercises until her muscles screamed. On Tuesday morning, she arrived at the facility to find herself the only woman among 15 male recruits taking the test. The men ranged in age from 18 to their early 30s, but they all shared one thing in common. They were all significantly larger than Sarah. The test administrator, a gruff master sergeant with arms like tree trunks, looked at the group and gave his standard speech about military standards and the importance of physical fitness. His eyes lingered on Sarah for just a moment longer than the others. "The push-up portion will be first," he announced. "You have 2 minutes to complete as many proper push-ups as possible. Your chest must touch the ground on each repetition, and your body must remain straight." The recruits spread out across the gymnasium floor. Sarah found a spot near the back, trying to ignore the sideways glances and whispered comments from some of the men nearby. 2 minutes starts now," the master sergeant called out. Sarah dropped into position and began her push-ups. She had practiced this exact scenario hundreds of times, focusing on maintaining perfect form while controlling her breathing. Around her, she could hear the huffing and grunting of the other recruits as they pushed their bodies to the limit. At the 1-minute mark, several of the men were already slowing down noticeably. Sarah maintained her steady rhythm, her arms burning, but her form still perfect. She had learned long ago that consistency was more important than explosive speed. "Time!" the master sergeant called out. Sarah immediately sat up, her arms shaking slightly from the effort. The administrator walked around to each recruit, recording their numbers. When he reached Sarah, his eyebrows raised slightly. 83, he said, writing the number on his clipboard. Several of the male recruits turned to look at her with surprise. 83 push-ups was well above the minimum requirement and higher than most of them had achieved. The sit-up portion went similarly. Sarah's core strength, developed through years of wrestling and focused training, allowed her to maintain a steady pace throughout the 2-minute period. When time was called, she had completed 91 sit-ups, but the real challenge was the 2-mile run. This was where her small size could either be a major advantage or a crippling disadvantage. Her shorter legs meant she had to take more steps to cover the same distance, but her lighter weight and efficient running form could help her maintain speed. The group lined up at the starting line of the base's running track. Sarah positioned herself in the middle of the pack, not wanting to start too fast and burn out early. The master sergeant raised his stopwatch. "Go!" The group took off at a pace that felt almost recklessly fast to Sarah. Several of the larger men immediately pulled ahead, their longer strides eating up ground quickly. Sarah held back, maintaining a pace she knew she could sustain. After the first quarter mile, the initial sprint pace began to take its toll on some of the front runners. Sarah gradually began moving up through the pack, passing men who were already breathing heavily and starting to slow. By the halfway point, Sarah was running in 4th place. Her breathing was controlled, and her legs still felt strong. She could hear the heavy footsteps and labored breathing of the men behind her, but her focus was entirely on the runners ahead. In the final quarter mile, Sarah made her move. She had been holding back just enough energy for this moment. Her pace quickened, and she began reeling in the 3 men ahead of her one by one. With 200 yards to go, she was in second place. The man ahead of her was a tall, muscular recruit who looked like he belonged on a football field. He was running hard, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders and the irregular rhythm of his breathing. Sarah pulled alongside him with 100 yards left. He glanced over at her, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been panic. He tried to match her acceleration, but his body was already at its limit. Sarah crossed the finish line 3 steps ahead of him, her final time well under the required standard. The master sergeant looked at his stopwatch and then at Sarah with an expression of genuine surprise. 12 minutes, 18 seconds, he announced. The gymnasium fell silent. Sarah's time wasn't just good enough to qualify for Special Forces selection. It was a time that would have been competitive in many college track programs. As Sarah walked over to collect her results, she could hear the whispered conversations among the other recruits and the administrative staff. The sergeant, who had initially tried to discourage her from even taking the test, approached her with a somewhat sheepish expression. "I have to admit, I didn't expect that," he said quietly. "Your scores are excellent. You've definitely qualified for Special Forces selection." Sarah nodded politely, but inside she was thinking about all the people who had told her she was too small, too weak, too different. The wrestling coach who had initially laughed at her, the guidance counselor who had tried to limit her ambitions, the countless teachers, employers, and authority figures who had made assumptions about her capabilities based on her size and appearance. But she was also thinking about what came next. Qualifying for Special Forces selection was just the first step. The actual selection course was notorious for its brutal physical and mental challenges. It was designed to break down even the strongest and most determined candidates. Sarah knew that her real test was just beginning. The people who had dismissed her so far had only seen her physical limitations. They hadn't yet encountered the thing that her high school wrestling coach had recognized, the unbreakable determination that lived inside her small frame. As she left the military facility that day, Sarah was already planning her preparation for the selection course. She knew that the men she would be competing against would be bigger, stronger, and faster than she was. But she also knew something they probably didn't. She had been underestimated her entire life, and she had never failed to prove her doubters wrong. The Special Forces selection course would be the ultimate test of that principle. For the first time in her life, Sarah would be competing on a level playing field, where determination and mental toughness mattered just as much as raw physical strength. She was ready to show the world what happened when someone dismissed Sarah Martinez as weak. 3 months later, Sarah found herself standing in a formation with 47 other soldiers at the Special Forces Assessment and Selection course at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The early morning mist hung low over the training grounds, and the temperature was barely above freezing. Sarah was the only woman in the group. Captain James Morrison, the selection course commander, paced in front of the formation like a predator sizing up its prey. He was a man who had spent 15 years in Special Forces with combat deployments to 3 different continents. His reputation was legendary among soldiers, fair but absolutely merciless when it came to standards. "Look around you," Captain Morrison called out, his voice cutting through the morning air. "Most of you will not be here in 3 weeks. This course has a failure rate of over 80%. We are not interested in making you feel good about yourselves. We are interested in finding soldiers who can operate in the worst conditions imaginable, alongside teammates whose lives depend on their competence." His eyes swept across the formation and stopped briefly on Sarah. She could see the question in his expression, the same doubt she had encountered everywhere else. But there was something else there, too. a willingness to let her prove herself one way or the other. "The first week will test your physical capabilities," Morrison continued. "But understand this, physical strength is only a small part of what we're looking for. We need soldiers who can think clearly when they're exhausted, who can solve problems under extreme stress, and who never quit even when quitting seems like the logical choice." The first challenge came just hours later. The candidates were divided into teams of 4 and given a series of obstacles that seemed designed to be impossible for any normal human being to complete. Heavy logs had to be carried across muddy fields. Walls that seemed impossibly high had to be scaled. Rope bridges had to be crossed while carrying full combat gear. Sarah was assigned to a team with 3 men: Rodriguez, a compact but muscular soldier from Texas; Jackson, a tall former college football player; and Williams, a quiet professional who had previously served with the Rangers. When they first saw their tiny teammate, their expressions ranged from confusion to barely concealed frustration. "No offense," Jackson said quietly during their first planning session, "but this is going to be rough. Some of these obstacles are designed for teams of strong guys." Sarah had heard variations of this conversation before. She nodded calmly and asked, "What's our first challenge?" The first obstacle was called the log carry. Each team had to transport a 200-pound log across a 2-mile course that included hills, streams, and thick forest. The log couldn't touch the ground, and all 4 team members had to maintain contact with it at all times. Rodriguez, Jackson, and Williams looked at the massive log and began discussing how the 3 of them could handle most of the weight, while Sarah just maintained the required contact. It was a reasonable plan that played to everyone's strengths, but Sarah had a different idea. "What if we rotate positions every 5 minutes?" she suggested. "That way, no one person gets completely exhausted." Jackson shook his head. "Sarah, no offense, but you weigh like half what we do. You can't carry an equal share of this thing." Sarah had expected this response. "I'm not talking about carrying an equal share of the weight. I'm talking about carrying it in a way that maximizes our team's efficiency." Before they could argue further, the whistle blew to start the challenge. The 3 men grabbed the log and hefted it to their shoulders, with Sarah maintaining contact as they had planned. For the first quarter mile, the system worked reasonably well. But by the half-mile mark, the men were already breathing heavily. The log seemed to get heavier with each step, and their coordination was starting to break down. Jackson stumbled slightly, causing the entire team to lose rhythm. "Rotation!" Sarah called out. "Not yet," Rodriguez gasped. "We got this." But they didn't have it. By the 1-mile mark, all 3 men were struggling significantly. Their pace had slowed to barely more than a walk, and they were starting to make mistakes that cost them time and energy. That's when Sarah implemented her real plan. "Guys, stop for a second," she said firmly. They set the log down, grateful for even a brief rest, despite the precious seconds it was costing them. Sarah moved to the front of the log. "I'm going to be the guide," she announced. "I'll run ahead and call out obstacles, changes in terrain, the best path forward. You 3 focus entirely on carrying and following my directions." Williams looked skeptical. "We can see where we're going." "Not when you're exhausted and focused on the weight," Sarah replied. "Trust me." It was a strategy that played to her strengths rather than trying to compensate for her limitations. Sarah's size allowed her to move quickly and efficiently while maintaining contact with the log. Her wrestling background had taught her to see opportunities and advantages that others missed. For the second half of the course, Sarah became the team's eyes and brain. She scouted ahead for the easiest paths, warned about holes and obstacles, and called out a steady rhythm that helped the men coordinate their movements. Her constant encouragement and tactical guidance allowed Rodriguez, Jackson, and Williams to focus entirely on the physical challenge. Their team finished the log carry in third place overall, a result that surprised everyone, including their teammates. "How did you know to do that?" Rodriguez asked as they walked back to the staging area. Sarah shrugged. "I've been figuring out ways to compete with bigger, stronger people my whole life. You learn to use your advantages instead of focusing on your disadvantages." Captain Morrison had been watching the exercise from various points along the course. He had noticed Sarah's team struggling in the first half and expected them to be among the slower finishers. The turnaround in their performance had caught his attention. That evening, he pulled Sarah aside after the daily debrief. "Interesting approach today," he said without preamble. "Thank you, sir." Morrison studied her for a moment. "In special forces, we often work with foreign militaries and local populations. Sometimes the most important skill is being able to adapt your approach to different situations and different people. What you did today showed that kind of thinking." Sarah nodded, but said nothing. She had learned that in military environments, it was often better to let your actions speak rather than trying to explain yourself. The challenges continued to escalate throughout the first week. Navigation exercises through dense forests with nothing but a compass and map. Problem-solving scenarios that required teams to move heavy equipment across obstacles using only basic materials. Physical fitness tests that seemed designed to find each candidate's breaking point. Sarah's approach remained consistent. Find ways to contribute that maximized her strengths while supporting her teammates' efforts. During navigation exercises, her attention to detail and methodical approach helped her team avoid the kinds of costly mistakes that eliminated other candidates. In problem-solving scenarios, her wrestling experience had taught her to think creatively about leverage and mechanical advantage. But it was during the individual psychological evaluations that Sarah faced her most difficult challenge yet. Dr. Elizabeth Chen was a military psychologist who had been evaluating Special Forces candidates for over a decade. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to identify the psychological traits that separated successful operators from those who would break under pressure. Sarah sat across from Dr. H. Chen in a small, sterile office, answering questions about her background, her motivations, and her understanding of what Special Forces service would entail. "I have to ask you something directly," Dr. Chen said about halfway through the session. "You're obviously intelligent and determined. You've done well in the physical challenges so far, but you're also significantly smaller than your peers, and you'll be operating in environments where that could be a serious disadvantage. How do you reconcile that reality with your desire to serve in this role?" Sarah had been expecting this question in some form since the day she first walked into the recruitment office. She had prepared various answers, but sitting in front of Dr. Chen, she decided to be completely honest. "Ma'am, I've been smaller than everyone around me my entire life," she said quietly. "I've learned that there are two ways to deal with that reality. You can accept that it limits what you're capable of, or you can find ways to turn it into an advantage." Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. "Give me an example." Sarah thought about her wrestling career, her performance on the log carry, all the times she had succeeded by approaching problems differently than everyone else. "In wrestling, I could never overpower my opponents," she said. "So I learned to outthink them. I studied their techniques, looked for patterns, found ways to use their strength and size against them. I got good at winning fights that I should have lost." "And how does that translate to Special Forces operations?" "Special Forces isn't about being the biggest or the strongest," Sarah replied. "It's about completing missions that seem impossible. Sometimes that requires unconventional thinking. Sometimes it requires someone who can fit through a small space, or who can blend in where others can't, or who can approach a problem from a direction that nobody expects." Dr. Chen made notes on her pad, her expression unreadable. "What happens if you encounter a situation where physical strength is the only solution, where there's no clever workaround or alternative approach?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Then I find a way to get stronger, or I find someone who can help me, or I fail and learn from it, but I don't quit. The psychological evaluation continued for another hour, covering everything from Sarah's family background to her understanding of the moral complexities of military operations. Dr. Chen probed for signs of the psychological weaknesses that often led to failures in Special Forces training: inability to handle stress, problems with authority, unrealistic expectations, or hidden motivations. But what she found in Sarah was something different. A young woman who had spent her entire life successfully overcoming obstacles that should have been insurmountable. More importantly, Sarah had developed a realistic understanding of her own capabilities and limitations, combined with an absolute refusal to let those limitations define what she could achieve. That night, Dr. Chen submitted her evaluation to Captain Morrison. Her recommendation was brief but definitive. Continue to monitor, but this candidate shows exceptional potential for success in unconventional operations. The second week of selection introduced new challenges that tested candidates in areas beyond pure physical capability: language aptitude tests, cultural sensitivity training, advanced medical scenarios, and complex tactical problems that required both individual skill and team coordination. Sarah excelled in areas that surprised her instructors. Her attention to detail made her extremely effective in medical training. Her ability to remain calm under pressure served her well in tactical scenarios. And her experience being different from everyone around her had given her an intuitive understanding of cultural sensitivity that many of her male counterparts lacked. But it was during a particularly difficult team exercise that Sarah demonstrated the quality that would ultimately define her Special Forces career. The scenario was designed to test leadership under extreme stress. Teams were given a rescue mission: locate and extract a wounded instructor from a mock village while under simulated enemy fire. The catch was that the team leader would be killed halfway through the mission, requiring someone else to take over and complete the objective. Sarah's team consisted of 4 candidates who had all emerged as natural leaders during the previous exercises. When their designated leader was killed by an instructor playing an enemy sniper, the remaining 3 men immediately began competing for control. The argument lasted only seconds, but in a real combat situation, those seconds could be fatal. Sarah didn't try to assert authority or join the debate. Instead, she simply started moving toward the objective, calling back to the others with clear, calm directions. "Rodriguez, you're our best marksman. I need you covering our approach from that building. Jackson, you and Williams move with me. We'll bound forward in teams while Rodriguez provides overwatch." It wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was a plan delivered with quiet confidence that assumed compliance. More importantly, it was a good plan that played to each team member's strengths. The 3 men looked at each other for a moment, then wordlessly began executing Sarah's directions. For the remainder of the exercise, she led the team with the same calm competence she had shown during the log carry, making tactical decisions that were sound and coordinating her teammates' actions effectively. They completed the rescue mission faster than any other team that day. Captain Morrison had been observing the exercise from a concealed position. He watched Sarah take control of a chaotic situation and turn it into a successful mission through leadership that was quiet but absolutely effective. That evening, he made a note in her evaluation file: "Natural leadership ability. Leads by competence and example rather than authority or volume. Team responds positively to her direction." But Sarah's most significant challenge was still ahead of her. The third week of selection would test every candidate's absolute limits, both physical and mental. It was the week that separated those who merely wanted to be Special Forces from those who had the inner strength to actually succeed in the role. And it was the week when Sarah would face the ultimate test of everything she had learned about overcoming the assumptions and limitations that others placed on her. The final week of Special Forces selection was known simply as the Crucible. Of the original 48 candidates who had started the course, only 19 remained. The others had been eliminated through injury, academic failure, or simply reaching their psychological breaking point. Sarah was still there, but she could feel the weight of expectation and doubt pressing down on her from every direction. Colonel William Hayes, the overall commander of the Special Forces training program, had flown in specifically to observe the final exercises. He was a legend in the Special Forces community, with over 20 years of operational experience and a reputation for having an almost mystical ability to identify soldiers who would excel in unconventional warfare. Hayes had been watching Sarah's progress throughout the selection course with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Her performance had been consistently strong, but he harbored deep concerns about how she would handle the most extreme physical and psychological challenges that Special Forces operators routinely faced. The final exercise was designed to be the ultimate test, a 72-hour mission that would push every remaining candidate beyond their perceived limits. Teams would be inserted into a remote training area with minimal equipment and tasked with completing a series of objectives while being hunted by an opposing force of experienced Special Forces soldiers. The scenario was designed to simulate being trapped behind enemy lines with limited resources and constant pressure. Candidates would have to navigate difficult terrain, solve complex problems with improvised materials, and demonstrate the mental toughness to continue operating effectively even when everything seemed hopeless. Sarah was assigned to a 4-person team with Rodriguez, who had become her closest ally during the course. Thompson, a former Marine with extensive combat experience, and Davis, a quiet professional who specialized in communications and electronics. Their first objective was to infiltrate a mock enemy facility and retrieve intelligence documents without being detected. The facility was an old training building surrounded by open ground, with instructors playing enemy sentries patrolling the perimeter. The team spent hours observing the facility, mapping the patrol patterns and looking for vulnerabilities. Every approach they considered seemed impossible. The building was surrounded by 50 yards of open ground in every direction, with bright security lighting and regular patrols. Thompson suggested waiting until dawn and making a quick assault when the sentries changed shifts. Rodriguez wanted to create a distraction on one side of the building while the team infiltrated from the other. Davis thought they should try to intercept the patrols and take their uniforms. All of the plans had merit, but they also had significant flaws that would likely result in detection and mission failure. Sarah had been studying the facility through binoculars for over an hour, not looking at the obvious features that her teammates were focused on, but examining the infrastructure and details that others might overlook. "There's a drainage pipe that runs under the building," she announced quietly. The others looked at her skeptically. Thompson shook his head. "Even if there is, it's probably too small for any of us to fit through." Sarah continued studying the facility. She had noticed a concrete drainage outlet on the far side of the building, partially hidden by vegetation. The pipe appeared to be about 18 inches in diameter, designed to channel rainwater away from the foundation. "It's too small for you guys," Sarah agreed. "But I think I can fit." Rodriguez looked concerned. "That's assuming it actually goes all the way through, and that there aren't grates or other obstructions. If you get stuck in there..." Sarah understood the risks. If the pipe was blocked or too narrow, she could become trapped in a confined space with no way for her teammates to help her. But she also understood that conventional approaches weren't going to work. "I'm going to scout it," she said simply. Before her teammates could argue, Sarah had slipped away into the darkness. Her small size allowed her to move through the underbrush almost silently, and her wrestling background had taught her how to control her body in tight spaces. The drainage outlet was even smaller than it had appeared through binoculars. Sarah lay flat on her stomach and peered into the pipe with a small flashlight. It extended straight ahead for about 30 feet before making a 90-degree turn. She could feel air moving through the pipe, suggesting that it did connect to the building's interior. Sarah had always been uncomfortable with tight spaces, but she had learned to push through discomfort when it was necessary. She turned off her flashlight, tucked it into her pocket, and began crawling into the pipe. The concrete was cold and damp, and there was barely enough room for her to move forward, using her elbows and knees. After about 20 feet, the pipe became even narrower, forcing her to exhale completely just to squeeze through. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest as she wondered if she would be able to turn around if she needed to retreat. But she kept moving forward. At the 90-degree turn, Sarah discovered that the pipe opened into a larger junction where several drainage lines converged. She could stand up in the junction, and she could see light filtering down from above through what appeared to be a maintenance access grate. Sarah climbed up to the grate and found herself looking into the basement of the target building. The room was dark and empty, exactly what they had hoped to find. The grate was secured with simple bolts that she was able to remove using her multi-tool. Within minutes, she was inside the facility. The intelligence documents were located exactly where the briefing had indicated they would be, in a file cabinet on the second floor of the building. Sarah moved through the building like a ghost, her small size allowing her to avoid detection even when she had to pass close to the mock enemy sentries. She retrieved the documents and was back in the drainage pipe within 20 minutes of entering the building. The crawl back to the exit point seemed faster, though no less uncomfortable. When she emerged from the pipe and rejoined her teammates, they were staring at her with expressions of amazement and disbelief. "You actually did it," Rodriguez whispered. Sarah handed him the intelligence documents. Objective complete. Colonel Hayes had been monitoring the exercise from the command post, watching as team after team failed to infiltrate the facility. When Sarah's team reported successful completion of the mission, he initially assumed they had found some vulnerability in the security setup that his instructors had missed. It wasn't until he received the full debrief that he learned about Sarah's infiltration through the drainage system. Hayes walked out to the facility personally to examine the pipe that she had crawled through. When he saw the 18-inch diameter opening, he knelt down and tried to imagine how anyone could fit through such a confined space, let alone navigate it in complete darkness while maintaining the focus necessary for a complex mission. "Sir," the exercise controller asked, "any problems with the setup?" Hayes stood up slowly, brushing dirt off his knees. "No problems," he said quietly. "But I think we need to add some additional security measures for future exercises." The remaining objectives in the 72-hour exercise continued to challenge every aspect of the candidates' abilities. They had to build improvised equipment to cross a river. They had to treat and evacuate a simulated casualty through difficult terrain. They had to call in a medical evacuation using radio procedures while under enemy fire. Throughout each challenge, Sarah continued to find ways to contribute that maximized her unique capabilities. During the river crossing, her lightweight allowed her to test improvised rope bridges that might not support her heavier teammates. During the casualty evacuation, her wrestling experience proved invaluable in learning how to lift and carry someone much larger than herself using proper technique. But it was during the final challenge that Sarah faced the ultimate test of everything she had learned about leadership and determination. The scenario was a simulated ambush. The team was moving through dense forest when they were suddenly engaged by a superior enemy force. In the chaos of the initial contact, both Rodriguez and Thompson were wounded by the exercise controllers, leaving Sarah and Davis as the only effective fighters. Davis was an excellent soldier, but he had never been comfortable in leadership roles. When the exercise controller told him that he was now the senior ranking member and needed to take charge of the situation, he froze. Sarah could see the panic in his eyes. They were pinned down by enemy fire. They had 2 wounded teammates who needed immediate medical attention, and their extraction point was still over a mile away through hostile territory. In a real combat situation, hesitation would be fatal. Sarah didn't wait for Davis to overcome his paralysis. She began giving orders in the same calm, confident voice that had served her throughout the selection course. "Davis, I need you on the radio calling for emergency extraction. Give them our grid coordinates and tell them we have 2 urgent casualties. Rodriguez, I know you're wounded, but can you still operate your weapon?" Rodriguez, who was playing the role of having a leg wound, nodded. "Good. You're going to provide covering fire while Davis and I move the casualties to that depression over there. It'll give us better cover while we wait for extraction." The plan was tactically sound and played to each person's capabilities, even accounting for their simulated injuries. More importantly, it was delivered with the kind of quiet authority that inspired confidence rather than debate. Davis immediately began working the radio while Rodriguez repositioned to provide better covering fire. Sarah took charge of moving Thompson, who was simulating a serious chest wound, to the more defensible position. The exercise continued for another 30 minutes, with Sarah coordinating her team's actions, making tactical decisions, and maintaining constant communication with the incoming extraction aircraft. When the helicopter finally arrived, her team had successfully defended their position and prepared both casualties for immediate evacuation. Colonel Hayes had been monitoring the exercise from a helicopter circling high above the area. He watched as Sarah took control of a chaotic situation and managed it with the kind of calm competence that he had seen in some of his best combat leaders. When the exercise concluded, Hayes landed and walked directly over to where the candidates were receiving their debriefs from the exercise controllers. "Martinez!" he called out. Sarah immediately came to attention. "Yes, sir." Hayes studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Around them, the other candidates and instructors had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening. "I've been in Special Forces for over 20 years, Hayes said finally. "I've served with some exceptional soldiers, and I've seen what happens when people are pushed beyond what they think they're capable of." Sarah waited, her heart pounding but her expression calm. "What I saw during that final exercise was something that can't be taught," Hayes continued. "Leadership under pressure. The ability to make sound decisions when everything is falling apart. The kind of judgment and composure that keeps people alive in impossible situations." He paused, looking around at the other candidates and instructors who were listening to every word. "When I first heard that a woman had made it through to the final week of this course, I had concerns," Hayes admitted. "I worried about physical limitations, about team cohesion, about whether the standards had somehow been compromised." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. After everything she had accomplished, was he about to tell her that it wasn't enough? "What I learned over the past 3 weeks is that I was asking the wrong questions," Hayes said. "I was focused on what you couldn't do instead of recognizing what you could do. I was thinking about limitations instead of capabilities." He stepped closer to Sarah, his voice becoming more personal. "The mission you completed at the target facility required someone with your exact combination of size, determination, and tactical thinking. The leadership you demonstrated during the final exercise showed me something I rarely see. The ability to step up and take charge not because of rank or authority, but because the situation demanded it, and you were the person best equipped to handle it." Hayes turned to address the group of candidates and instructors. "Special Forces doesn't need soldiers who fit a particular physical profile," he announced. "We need soldiers who can accomplish impossible missions regardless of the obstacles they face. We need people who can think creatively, lead effectively, and never quit even when quitting seems like the logical choice." He looked back at Sarah with something that might have been a smile. Congratulations, Martinez. You've just become the first woman to successfully complete Special Forces selection. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds before Rodriguez started clapping. Davis joined him, then Thompson, and within moments the entire group was applauding. Sarah stood at attention, struggling to process what had just happened. 6 months ago, a military recruiter had tried to talk her out of even taking the fitness test. 3 weeks ago, she had been one of 48 candidates, most of whom probably expected her to be eliminated in the first few days. Now she was officially qualified to begin the next phase of Special Forces training. That evening, as the successful candidates prepared to leave the selection site, Colonel Hayes approached Sarah one final time. "You know this is just the beginning, right?" he asked. "Selection is hard, but the actual Special Forces qualification course is even more challenging, and after that you'll be assigned to an operational team where you'll need to earn the respect and trust of soldiers who may not be ready to accept you as an equal." Sarah nodded. She had always known that her challenges wouldn't end with completing selection. "I have one piece of advice for you," Hayes continued. "Don't try to prove that you're as good as the men you'll serve with. You've already proven that you're better than most of them at the things that matter most. Focus on being the best Special Forces soldier you can be, and let your performance speak for itself." 3 months later, Sarah was assigned to her first operational team. She was nervous about meeting her new teammates, wondering how they would react to having a woman in their unit. Her team leader was Master Sergeant Kevin Murphy, a 15-year veteran with multiple combat deployments. When Sarah reported to him for the first time, he looked her up and down with the same skeptical expression she had encountered so many times before. "So you're the one who crawled through that drainage pipe," he said without preamble. "Yes, Sergeant." Murphy was quiet for a moment, studying her with the calculating look of someone who had learned to judge people quickly and accurately. "I've read your selection file," he said finally. "Hayes wrote that you're the most tactically innovative candidate he's evaluated in 5 years. Rodriguez, who's now in second group, told me you're the best leader he's ever worked with." Sarah waited for the inevitable but. Instead, Murphy extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Martinez. We've got a mission briefing in an hour, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the tactical approach." As Sarah shook his hand, she realized that something fundamental had changed. For the first time in her military career, she wasn't being judged by her size or her gender. She was being evaluated based on her demonstrated capabilities and her potential contribution to the mission. The girl who had been dismissed as too weak, too small, too different, had become a Special Forces soldier, and everyone who had underestimated her along the way had learned something important. Never judge someone's capabilities based on their appearance. Sarah Martinez had proven that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people who don't fit our expectations, and she had done it not by becoming someone different, but by refusing to let anyone else's limitations define what she could accomplish.